We are back with the next book in the Bible in our Walk Through the Word series, and that book is Esther. Esther is named for the main character of the book. She's introduced in chapter 2, verse 7. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, and that name means myrtle, as in the wood, myrtle wood. And her Persian name is Esther, which is star. Daughter of a star, something along that line. She is known from that point on in the book, chapter 2, verse 7, as Esther, not Hadassah, which is her Hebrew name. Interesting tidbit about the book of Esther is God's name, or any derivative thereof, any form of his name, is not mentioned, never mentioned. God is never mentioned in the book, which is sort of strange for a Bible book, but that is it nonetheless, never mentioned. Who wrote it? Author is unknown. Agreement among historians that there is no way that they can tell who the author is. It's assumed and safely assumed that he knew quite a bit about Persian culture because he wrote quite a bit about it, as well as Jewish. So he was probably a Jew living there in Persia. He writes as one who had an eyewitness account of the events that are recorded in the book of Esther. Why? Why is it written? Is it a love story? Hollywood would think so. There's a movie from a few years back, I guess, One Night with the King. And I typed in One Night with the King on Google, and it came up saying that it is a movie, drama, and romance movie. So Hollywood thinks it's a romance. What do we think? What does the Bible say? I believe that very clearly it speaks of God's providence for his people, his protection for his people, for the sake of his promise that was given. Really, back in the garden, but you might say defined as he gave the promise to Abraham, that in your seed, that is thy seed, through his descendants, the whole of the world will be blessed. And the psalmist writes, and behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. So he is going to keep his people for the sake of his promise. Just as Ezra and Nehemiah were both, their books spoke of God's providence and protection through a pagan king, pagan nations, that they would rebuild Jerusalem now. And of course, this is in the same time period as Ezra, Nehemiah. Esther's in that same time period. We'll get into that a little bit. So you think of the two great captivities, the bondage in Egypt, which God meant for good to save his people again. So his promise would be preserved, the promise that would go through the lineage of Abraham as we go from generation to generation. And now the Babylonian captivity, again, the protection of his people for the sake of his promise. Not only for progeny's sake, but for temple worship and the building of his kingdom and making sure that everything is done according to his divine plan and prophecy and so on and so forth. God's plan. You know, the events, the accounts in the Bible were not done in some kind of a vacuum that people just decided this is what I'm going to do today. But they were all actors, for lack of a better term, in the great plan, the great play of God's plan of salvation. And we are the recipients thereof, of course. Where did it take place? We read right in the beginning, chapter 1, verse 2, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus, and Ahasuerus is also known as Xerxes I. So Ahasuerus or Xerxes the first, the same person. When he sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, or Susa. It's in the empire of the Persian Empire. We were reminded of that in the book of Nehemiah, Susa. So it's in the same. Remember what I said about Nehemiah? That's really the end of the chronology that we find in the Old Testament, beginning with Genesis and going all the way through to the end of Nehemiah. The book of Esther now is put within that time period. It doesn't follow chronologically, so we're sort of going to go back in time now. in the life of Esther. Okay? When? We don't know. Being we don't know who wrote it, it's hard to figure out when it was written. Probably written around 400 BC. It was written after the events that took place during the book of Esther. We do have dates for when this book, the time period in which this book was written. It's written at the time of Xerxes I, or Ahasuerus. He reigned from 485 to 465 BC. And therefore there's a 20-year reign. So it was during this 20-year reign, I read somewhere that, I don't have it cited here, but read somewhere that this took place within about a 10-year period of time, because Mordecai reigned or helped. He was elevated to a position for about 8 years, and his position ended the same time as Xerxes I ended, and this time of choosing the king, Queen Esther, is about 2 years. Anyway, probably about 10-year period of time within the 20-year reign of Ahasuerus. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. Xerxes, I'll say Xerxes, that's an easier name to pronounce. Okay, it begins in the 3rd year of his reign. That's chapter 1, verse 3, in the 3rd year of his reign. So that would be around the year 483 or so BC is when this story begins. Historians place the book of Esther in between or within chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra. And if you go back in your memory, I will refresh your memory. The 6 and 7 of Ezra was when the temple was rebuilt by Ezra and the Passover was instituted. Now these people here in the time of Esther were still in Babylon. Everybody did not return from Babylon to Jerusalem. In fact, some stayed there until they died. They never returned. But the time of the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstitution of the Passover in the book of Ezra is where the historians place the book of Esther. Okay? So, here we are. The time has been, the place has been established. The Persian Empire, the time has been established during the return of the captives from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So, the subject of the book, we talked about one, of course, that's Esther, but there are also other people in the book, and one is Queen Vashti, Xerxes, we heard of him, of course, Mordecai, and Haman. Those are the main characters. Esther, Queen Vashti, King Xerxes, Mordecai, and Haman. There was a feast. King Xerxes had a feast, and he invited his wife, Queen Vashti, to attend the feast. She refused. The result of that was the people had a fear then that in all the households in the Persian Empire, the wives would not do what the husbands had asked them to do. There would be a revolt among the women. They wouldn't listen to their husbands. So a letter went out that she would be removed of her duty, and chapter 1, verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. Remember the law of the Medes and the Persians. Their laws were unrevocable, and they were recorded. They were written down. So we have a lot of real good history around this time period because of the laws that were written down and preserved. Okay? We're introduced to Mordecai in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Okay, so this is there. They're taken away from the Holy Land, Judah, Jerusalem, and they are brought to Babylon. This puts Mordecai and his niece. He brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful. I guess that would probably be a cousin, his uncle's daughter, be a cousin, who Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So Esther was now living in the house of Mordecai, her cousin, because her parents had died. Okay? Now, the decree went out from Xerxes that Vashti would be removed from her position as the queen and the wife. he chooses Esther. This is sort of like a beauty pageant type thing, for lack of a better term, and he chooses her. She was beautiful to look upon, fair to look upon, and he chooses her to be the queen. And that is in chapter 2, verse 17. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So now Queen Esther. King Xerxes and Queen Esther. The king promotes a man named Haman to be above all the princes anyway. So he's way up there, secretary of whatever, within the kingdom there, and he is expected to be bowed down to. Well, Mordecai does not bow himself down to Haman. Mordecai, of course, being a Jew, would bow himself only to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Although God isn't mentioned, we know that that is the practice of the Jews. They're not going to bow down themselves to an earthly king or a ruler. So this obviously bothers Haman a little bit, and he begs a decree from the king to kill all of the Jews because he knows Mordecai is a Jew. This causes a great mourning and fasting among the Jews, and they are wondering, what are they going to do? Chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. Here comes Esther and Mordecai together in this situation that the Jews are thrust into by the hatred of Haman because of Mordecai. Mordecai commanded to answer Esther. Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Don't think that you don't have an obligation here for your people. You're in the king's house. You have an obligation now for your people, even though you're not going to escape. You're not going to hide from this duty that you have to your people just because you're in the king's house. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And now this very famous verse from the book of Esther. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Mordecai is charging her that she has a duty for the protection of her people. And we might think of that as just a respect for your own kinfolk and so on and so forth. But we know that God has a greater plan than just one that would meet the eye. So the king finds out then from his records, remember the records, the laws and the records of the Medes and the Persians, that Mordecai had at one time been involved in saving his life, saving the king's life. And as a result, the king demands Haman, now his secretary or governor, whatever you would call him, to honor Mordecai, which of course irritates him beyond all limits. And he had prepared, of course, a place then before that where Mordecai would be killed and whatever. And at that point in time then, Esther reveals herself to the king. Esther reveals herself not only as a Jew, but she reveals that there is somebody who has plotted to kill all of the Jews. Xerxes asks, who is this? Who's plotted to kill you and your people? And she says, Haman. So Xerxes then causes Haman, or demands that Haman would be hung on the gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai the Jew. So, wow, what a twist of plot here. Haman is hung on the gallows that he had prepared for another. Esther makes a plea then to the king to reverse Haman's orders that all the Jews would be killed, as in chapter 8. And he obliges, and not only to that extent, but that the Jews then in battle destroy all of their enemies. So not only were the Jews let me go back. Haman originally wanted all the Jews to be destroyed because Mordecai did not bow down to him. Well, the whole thing switches around. He is then hung on the gallows that were designed for Mordecai, and not only were the Jews destroyed, but the Jews destroyed all of their enemies, all those who were against her, plotted to kill the Jews. So the Jews were saved from this, and in the last chapter, chapter 9, not the last chapter. Chapter 10 is the last one. Chapter 9, we are told of the institution of the Feast of Purim. And the Feast of Purim is something that the Jews still commemorate of this, the salvation of the Jews from the hand of the wicked Haman. Okay? That's the story. And it, of course, is a wonderful story. It is a love story, a dramatic turn of events. The plot twist is quite interesting. It makes a good movie, right? Well, what is the application of this book? What do we now, as children of God, children of the promise, glean from this book? I'm going to read from the Lutheran Study Bible. The first thing we talked about, the promise of God, okay? As you study Esther, remember why God worked through Esther and Mordecai to deliver the people of Judah. It was all part of God's plan that the Savior would be born to that people in the land God had designated and at just the right moment. And then he quotes from Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, when the fullness of the time had come. Okay? So not only had God promised that a Savior would be born, the Messiah would be born from the lineage of Abraham, as he repeats that to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and their lineage from then on, but also that he would be born in a particular place, born in Bethlehem. Not that he would be born somewhere out in Babylon, but no, they would be brought back to Bethlehem or to Judea, and there the Messiah would be born. Another very interesting thing that we find out here in the history books is the institution of the synagogue. And I will read here from, let's see, who wrote this? It's from the Jewish Encyclopedia. So we're going right to the source, the Encyclopedia of the Jewish people. Synagogue. The synagogue as a permanent institution, and now the synagogue is the house of worship for the Jewish people. There's a synagogue here in Vancouver, the Kol, K-O-L, space A-M-I, Kol Amai or Kol Ami or some, I don't know exactly how you would pronounce it, synagogue. So the synagogue as a permanent institution originated probably in the period of the Babylonian captivity, when a place for common worship and instruction had become necessary. Remember, the temple had been destroyed, they've been taken out of Jerusalem, they're put in Babylon in captivity, and they set up these synagogues, these places of we'll call them worship, where they would read from the law and they would be reminded of the instructions that the law had for them. Okay? After the return from the captivity, when the religious life was reorganized, especially under Ezra and his successors, congregational worship, consisting in prayer and the reading of sections from the Bible, developed side by side with the revival of the cult of the temple. Now, cult there means just the practice of the temple at Jerusalem, and thus led to the building of synagogues. Synagogue worship, if you would be interested in looking that up, it's very similar even to the way we worship now in our congregation. Maybe, I would say probably in general in Christian congregations. There's singing of hymns, there's reading of scripture, there's offering of prayers, there's reading of texts, and there's instruction from the text. It very closely follows synagogue worship. So what is synagogue worship? What does it have anything to do with us now as Christians? Chapter 9 of Acts, verse 20. This is the very beginning of the life of the Apostle Paul as he was converted from his Jewish faith to the Christian faith. Chapter 9 of Acts, verse 19. When he, that is Paul, had received meat, he was strengthened. Then was Saul, his name Saul at that time, his name was later changed to Paul, as we know. Then was Saul certain days with the disciples which were at Damascus. And straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, which were at, or that he is the Son of God. So straightway, immediately, he preached Christ where? In the synagogues. It says later on in the book of Acts that he went to the synagogue as his practice was, as the manner was for him to go to the synagogue and to preach Christ. So God had established through this seemingly bad thing. He had made sure that his promise would be fulfilled, that the Messiah would be born of the lineage, the house and lineage of David, promised to Abraham years before that. He would be born in Judea according to the prophecy spoken of him, the book of Micah especially, and also that synagogue worship would be established. And then in the new church, the Christian church and the Acts of the Apostles, Paul and the other apostles could go into the synagogue where it was customary for the Jews to gather, and he would preach in the synagogue, he would preach Christ. So God had established these things whereby now his church could be not only established, but would go forth, and it would spread out throughout the Holy Roman the Roman Empire. That became the Holy Roman Empire later, but the Roman Empire at that time. Here's God's providence, not only for his people, but for the sake of his promise, and for the sake of us who now are the children of his promise. As the book of Galatians tells us, that we who are of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. So, interesting story. And I use that word loosely. It's not a story. Account would be a better term of the life of Esther and how God used her for his divine purpose. God's peace until we meet next time in going into the book of Job. See you then. I guess that's a goodbye.